So this is another boring nerd video, but this time I'm talking about Linux, rather than Unix. And to keep you guys interested, I'm going to put funny green screen effects every few minutes. So what even is Linux? Well, Linux is an open source operating system kernel. Linux itself is not the operating system, unlike Unix, which is the actual operating system. Linux is the kernel. Okay, well, the kernel, basically, it sits between your computer's hardware and your actual applications, you know, the stuff you interact with your mouse and such, but yeah, I'm not going to go into detail about what exactly the kernel does, because that's boring. But you're not here for an explanation of Linux, you're here for a historical explanation of Linux. The history of Linux starts with Unix. I told you it was important. But the thing about Unix is that it wasn't open source, so users legally could not modify it. This angered one Richard Stallman, who, in 1983, started the GNU project, which had the goal of creating a complete Unix-compatible software system, basically replacing Unix's proprietary, non-free software with his own free and open source software. It was a big project because Unix had a lot of programs. Also, by the way, I thought I'd just let you know, but GNU stands for GNU's not Unix. However, despite the efforts by Richard Stallman, most of GNU's programs needed an operating system, which he didn't have. But luckily for him, across the Atlantic, at the University of Helsinki, a man named Linus, not Tech Tips, Torvalds, was frustrated that the operating system Minix was for educational purposes only, so he just made his own. But again, he didn't create the operating system. He created the kernel for an operating system. Remember that. And this is where the GNU project comes back in, because all of the programs and such ran on this new kernel. So Linus decided to name his new kernel Freaks, a portmanteau of free and freak, with the X added because Unix also had an X, since Freaks was Unix-like, not directly based on Unix like BSD, but it was very similar to it. But you may be screaming at me right now, where is Unix? Well, Linus initially considered the name Linux, but he said no because he considered it to be too egotistical. Well, too bad for Linus and his selflessness, because the server he was hosting Freaks on thought that Freaks was a bad name, and they called it Linux anyways. And Linus responded to this by using the name Linux anyways. So at first, Linux was used by hobbyists and nerds! But then around the mid-90s, supercomputer community started to use Linux. And even NASA used Linux for their own supercomputers. But the 90s was like, what, a million years ago, man? What about today? I bet Linux died a long time ago. Wrong! Are you a stink droid user? Linux! The Chromebooks in your backpacks? Linux! The internet? 96% Linux. And that's not all. There's about 1 trillion different Linux operating systems called distributions that are designed just for regular use by regular people like you and me. Alright, well, that's the history of Linux. Thanks for watching, boyos. Goodbye. Nah. This video isn't long enough. But the problem is, there's not much more history for Linux other than it got better over the years. So now I'm going to talk about the Linux distributions themselves, or distros for short. And each Linux distro is for each kind of Linux user. You have beginner distros such as Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and pop_OS exclamation mark, where you click install, wait a few minutes, and bam, your Linux is ready. You can just click install on any application you want. And then there's some distros where, well, why don't I just show you? if I told you, that's not even the hardest distro to install. To an experienced Linux user, such as myself, Arch Linux's baby Gentoo, and specifically Linux from scratch, are generally known as the hardest ones to install, but the complexity for Arch still continues. Now let's say you want to install Steam on Arch Linux. Well, to do that, you have to go into a config file, enable the multi-lib repository, then type sudo pacman-S lowercase y steam, and it does the do. Alright, well that's really enough about Arch Linux, and you know what, actually, I'll say that's the end of this video. Alright, goodbye.